Hello, welcome to the second part of your psychopharmacology unit. This lecture is specifically on substance abuse and addiction. In part one of the lecture, we talked about the mechanisms of pharmacokinetics, how drugs work on nervous tissues in particular, and psychopharmacology in general. In this second part of the lecture, we're going to focus on common substances of abuse and how they translate to problems of addiction.
The general characteristics of addiction are pretty commonly understood, certainly through portrayals in popular media. Some of you may also have had the misfortune, as I have, of relatives succumbing to addiction of one type or another. Some substances are so motivating that all else pales in comparison. Voluntary drug use doesn't always lead to addiction. One can quit, one can use occasionally or socially, but compulsive involuntary use of substances or behaviors, as we'll come to understand, are really the crux of what defines an addictive situation. Addictive behaviors are compulsive behaviors that provide pleasure, that can be expensive, in much the same way that drugs that are addictive can do. The extent of drug use in the United States is rather dramatic, with frequency in descending order, going from caffeine, alcohol, and cigarettes as being the most commonly abused drugs to marijuana, and then psychotherapeutics, cocaine, followed by hallucinogens, methamphetamine, and heroin. Psychoactive drugs are those substances that are chemical in nature, such as caffeine and alcohol, and have the effect of changing neuroendocrine physiology and our experience of our environment in typically pleasurable ways. Caffeine is the most widely used psychoactive stimulant. We know this from experience and observation on a daily basis. It has the effect of increasing your level of alertness and energy, particularly after a late night out or an all-nighter with a crying baby. Alcohol is an example of many psychoactive substances that are culturally acceptable to use on a regular basis, similar to nicotine and caffeine. Alcohol, in fact, is a regular part of the human diet around the globe. There's some evidence of non-human primates, i.e. chimpanzees, actually eating fermented fruit and reveling in the experience of that. Wine is part of religious rituals. Those of you who are Christians will, particularly Catholics, recognize the incorporation of red wine as symbolic of Christ's blood in the Mass. So it's interesting that something that has so much cultural and social significance can also become an object of abuse. Cigarettes are a psychoactive substance that many of us are exposed to long before we observe anyone taking alcohol in particular. Nicotine is the drug in tobacco that reaches the brain through the lungs. And smokers report that nicotine is particularly mood enhancing. And in fact, we know from observations of people with mental illness, for instance, that nicotine is an often used self-administered drug to alleviate symptoms of psychosis. So interestingly, the amount of nicotine in cigarettes has gone up over the last several decades, and the higher nicotine containing cigarettes are preferred by poor and minority populations. Why? I'd like for you and for us as a community to consider some of the potential reasons motivating people who are poor and marginalized to purchase those brands that are more addictive. Is it a marketing problem, or is it a different kind of explanation that we need? Of the nearly 2.5 million Americans who use marijuana for the first time every year, more than half are under the age of 18. 1 in 6 young people who try marijuana, according to the Chicago Bureau, has the potential to become addicted. The active ingredient in marijuana is tetrahydrocannabinol, or THC. The super interesting thing about THC is that it is fat soluble and consequently can stay in your body's fat stores for much longer than you think. And so the report from users of marijuana that they are not addicted can be explained by the fact that subsequent to the use of marijuana, some small amount will be released from your fat stores on a regular basis. So individuals are able to self-wean, in a sense, and don't experience the sudden and dramatic withdrawal effects. Unfortunately, and especially in this day and age, we live in a society where pain relievers, tranquilizers, sedatives, and stimulants, drugs that are prescribed for medical purposes, are abused. And Tennessee happens to be a hotbed of this particular phenomenon. While cigarette use is, less and less common, but still more prevalent than cocaine use, we see that heavy smokers are especially likely to abuse cocaine as an addictive substance. Hallucinogens are drugs such as LSD and magic mushrooms, as they're sometimes called, that taken orally can distort reality, causing users to experience visions. Many of you have heard of or unfortunately experienced the situation with methamphetamine abuse in the state of Tennessee. It's a drug that's artificially produced, can originate from a cat plant, has effects that are similar to those of other stimulants, and is cheap and easy to manufacture, particularly for individuals who don't live near major cities where drug trafficking is a concern. Opiates are drugs processed from the poppy plant, and many are prescribed medicines such as codeine, morphine, and heroin. They produce a rush similar to cocaine and have a tendency to reduce anxiety. Unfortunately, they are highly toxic, and in addition to being vulnerable to abuse, they can lead to overdose. People who use drugs on a regular basis, unfortunately, are terrible at forecasting the pleasure to be gotten from taking a drug. Smokers underestimate how hooked they are on cigarettes, and heroin addicts underestimate how powerful their cravings can become after a period of abstinence. Craving is the feeling of an intractable urge to take the drug or engage in the behavior that is so desirable for an addict. Addiction involves dependence, which is an intense craving, seeking out, and use of the drug. This figure shows a pattern of opiate intake in people experiencing conditions of continuous drug availability, and the graph shows the amount of the drug taken over consecutive days. This illustrates tolerance because over time you need more of the drug in order to get the same effect, in part because receptor populations that the drug binds to in the brain decrease, making it harder and harder to get the same high. The withdrawal syndrome is the drug opposite effect, which is characterized by greater and greater feelings of unpleasantness with drug cessation. We have not evolved an ability to like drugs in the way that we have evolved an ability to like and want and need sustaining food or water. Drugs have their pleasurable effects via the brain's pleasure areas. By hijacking the normally occurring neurotransmitter and electrical impulse-mediated processes of the brain. Mesolimbic dopamine is that brain system that is most significantly impacted by drugs of abuse. Dopamine is a major neurotransmitter everywhere in the brain, and there are four main dopamine pathways. Psychoactive drugs cause increases in the activity of the mesolimbic dopamine system in particular, and that leads to the feelings of pleasure and euphoria that emerge from drug taking. The psychosocial context also involves an interplay with genes or the genetic makeup of an individual. We know that drug abuse is somewhat similar to cardiovascular disease, which is multifactorial, meaning that lots of different things can impact whether or not you develop cardiovascular disease, as well as drug abuse. A genetic predisposition or inclination to use and abuse drugs can be determined in studies of gene-environment interactions, in particular looking at the heritability of, for instance, alcoholism across generations within the same family. But the disposition or predisposition doesn't necessarily mean that addiction is an inevitable outcome. There's always a interaction on which this depends, and that interaction is between the genes supporting addiction and a drug facilitating environment. As you can see from the figure here, socioeconomic status has an effect on whether or not a predisposition to a number of factors actually would be realized. Childhood socioeconomic status, as well as the level of an individual's education down the line, have the potential impact of amplifying or, in the best case scenario, attenuating genetic predispositions. So you can take someone with quote-unquote bad genes, put them in a better environment, economically and socially, give them a high degree of education, and maybe completely reverse the vulnerability that they were genetically endowed. Environment is important as a modulator of addiction because, you know, initially in childhood, it's socioeconomic status. Low socioeconomic status means that you are exposed to more people with fundamental needs that are unsatisfied, culminating in their use of addictive substances, perhaps. And later, when you are old enough to use drugs, the environment can have the impact of triggering desire or a drug-seeking habit. Drug relapse especially illustrates the importance of environment. Conditioning theories have shown or can show that drug relapse after a period of abstinence, after recovery, can be triggered by exposure to that environment of abuse, to people and events and situations and settings in which the abusive behavior occurred. Stress management is very important as well because we know that drug cravings and relapse into addictive behavior are greatly increased with exposure to psychosocial stress. Behavioral addictions include a number of things that are seemingly positive, but can be negative in the context of the extent to which they cause upheaval in the life of the addict. Exercise is an example of a potentially positive addiction that can be turned incredibly negative. So it is disruptive of a person's uh, livelihood, of their relationships, and that they show signs of dependence. So, what about shopping? Um, Shopping is like exercise in that it can be reinforced um, through similar addictive mechanisms because of the euphoria and mood um, effects of accumulating material possessions. The decline in euphoria from exercise that results from physical conditioning is similar to what you would expect from drug tolerance, so that people who are addicted to exercise need to exercise longer and more frequently in order to experience those positive effects. Consequently, when an exercise addict stops exercising or maybe suffers from the flu and can't exercise for a period of time, like other drugs of abuse, um, abstention leads to depression, anxiety, irritability, resembling drug withdrawal.